when we talk about kind of this new type of immigrant, and this is not all of them. I am very close with lots of Somali, Hmong activists who are Republican, but what ends up happening is there is not this idea of a melting pot. There's a cloistering. There is a certain tribalism that has happened in Minnesota, as I referenced before in the mayoral election. And so when you have people here who stay in their group, who basically operate as almost like self-governing societies, that has had an impact on our state. And I won't say that all fraud have been perpetrated by Somalis. There's been plenty of cases where the fraudsters look like me or you. But because Minnesota, like I said before, constantly boasts about how generous our welfare programs are, that attracts a certain type of mindset. And over and over and over again, you're catering to a group that is that wants to stay to themselves.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim, and I'm the CEO of American Moment, and I'm very glad to have you back with us for another fantastic episode. This week, we brought, I actually think he is my oldest friend in the entire world, Max Rymer, a great guy from the great state of Minnesota that I've known for over a decade now. My first job in politics was door knocking for him in Minnesota House District 49B. We knocked on basically every door in Bloomington, Edina, and Eden Prairie. We had a blast doing that. He was really the person who probably most formed my political worldview really early on. So any of you former fellows or program graduates of ours listening, he's a lot of the reason I do what I do today. So I think this will be a really interesting episode for you guys to hear more about him, about what's going on in Minnesota, and why the situation is so dire. So we will go now to my oldest friend, Max Rymer. Max, thanks so much for coming on Moment of Truth.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
So I told you before we started recording that I was going to kiss your ass a little bit before we started. Anybody who has ever come through American Moment programming ever has this guy to thank, not only for me getting into politics in the first place, but also being as based and red-pilled as I am. Max, many years ago, literally 10 years ago, next year.
Isn't that crazy? We've known each other that long.
I know. Was running for the Minnesota House of Representatives in House District 49B.
Never forget it.
I still have one of those green signs in my garage to this day. And you and I knocked basically every door in that district.
In Bloomington, Minnesota, where for the listeners, for the audience, it's where the Mall of America is.
Yes.
And young Max and young Nick, we thought we had a shot as Republicans to go and win that place.
You know, it's actually really funny thinking back because that was the night that Trump won.
Yes.
And because it was 2016, and I was still so sad because you lost.
I know. We found out pretty early in the night that it wasn't going to be our night. Yeah. And then to go from that, working so hard, to Trump winning, it was kind of like this, like, whoa, okay, I'm happy again.
Yeah. It's a really, really crazy experience, but I do owe a lot to you. You were my first mentor when I was in school, and I think everybody at American Moment owes a debt to you because of that as well. So
too kind. What I will just say though is vice versa, and I know we don't want this to be an ass-kissing session, the whole podcast, but
nobody else cares.
Listen, you hear Nick all the time. He obviously runs this organization. You've built it from the ground up. But man, when I look at where you were when I first met you to where you are now and everything that you built, it's like to be part of that story, to like be one small cog in this story of Nick and this organization, you just needed a shot. I think most men and most people in America you need one person to come along and believe in you,
Yeah.
And I think when we met, it was one of those things where you didn't really have much of a direction.
Yeah.
And over time, I've gotten to see you grow. I've gotten to know your family. I've gotten to see you build that life outside of this. And I just couldn't be more proud of you, man, and the work that you're doing.
I appreciate that. All right, ass kissing over.
All right, let's get into
it. So tell us a little bit about your background. You are currently a state legislator in Minnesota, in the Minnesota House of Representatives. You also work in the real estate business. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up here.
Yeah. So please forgive the accent. Obviously, I am from Minnesota.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I have been involved in politics in Minnesota for the past, call it 13 years, basically since right after college for me. And for a spell, I was national committee man. I obviously ran for House in 2016 in the state of Minnesota, and then ended up running again. We moved out of the Twin Cities during COVID, moved about 45 minutes north to a place called Chisago County. Beautiful place. Like many blue states, you have pockets where it is just beautiful. The landscape, the environment, the neighborhood you're in, it's just a wonderful place to live. And that seat came open this past election cycle, and I ended up running, getting what we call the endorsement for that position as the Republican, and winning. So just finished up my first session this past May. And in my private life, yeah, so I've been in the marketing business. I've been an entrepreneur, basically, again, since out of college, and own a marketing agency. Obviously, Nick, you and I worked together at a previous agency and do digital marketing for real estate agents. We also ended up opening up a brokerage, a mortgage brokerage, about 2 years ago as well. So I own two companies. I have an ownership team that I work with. The marketing agency is called Platform. The mortgage brokerage is called the John Galt Mortgage Company, kind of a conservative themed mortgage company. And yeah, it's been a really interesting time to live in Minnesota. Actually, I don't think there's ever been a Minnesota interesting time to live in Minnesota. And then also a very interesting time to work in the mortgage business and the housing crisis that we face in America.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the political trajectory of Minnesota over the last, call it 10 years. I mean, I remember in 2016, the president came extremely close, much closer than I think anybody ever thought, to winning the state of Minnesota. To, this last election cycle, the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party being the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. Every time I have friends that have a long layover in the Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport, they're like, this feels like the least American place in America. And people also remember Minneapolis getting burned down during the George Floyd riots and all of that stuff. I mean, what has happened in the last 10 years? I mean, it's a crazy time in Minnesota politics.
I think when you read about Minnesota and specifically Minneapolis in the headlines, all of it can be attributed to this one very simple fact that baked into our DNA is our Scandinavian heritage. When you talk about the bar that is required for people to make a change in government in Minnesota, that bar is so much higher for us in Minnesota than it is, I would contend, anywhere else in the country. Generally speaking, Minnesotans want to believe my government is good. And even if they're screwing up, my government has the best of intentions for me. When you talk about kind of the broad populace, suburbia in Minnesota, that is the mentality. And that has caused unending chaos in our state, because at least when Tim Walz jumped in for the vice presidential race, I'm sure you had friends. I certainly had friends who asked me, how did this guy get through? How does this guy governor? Because he's such a doofus. And he made a doofus of himself on the national stage over and over and over again.
He is friends with school shooters.
Yeah. I will never forget that soundbite.
I will never forget that.
And the whole woo, cheerleading palm arm thing, that was like a new invention of Tim Walz that he just decided to bust out when he ran for vice president. But the reason is because people know that Tim Walz has screwed up, but there's a huge gulf between knowing Tim Walz screwed our state up and wanting to vote Republican. It's just something that's baked into our DNA. So when you talk about the problems that Minnesota is facing, from police in Minneapolis dropping out of the force, to unending crime, to taking what we had, and for our state it was a big deal, taking an $18 billion surplus and in the course of 2 years turning it into a $6 billion deficit. People want to believe that Tim Walz is a good man who's trying his best. That's what you can attribute it to. And most of that money that I just talked about has gone to, I won't say most of it, but a significant portion of it, we're learning over time now, has gone to fraud. And Minnesota, we kind of claim that we have these generous benefits. It's why we're a magnet for all sorts of people, non-producing people moving into the state, and high-producing people moving out of the state, because we brag about how generous our welfare state is. And what we're seeing now at a pretty rapid pace, there's a new news story, it seems like every week in Minnesota, of a brand new fraud scheme. We had the biggest food fraud in United States history when COVID happened, and then Feeding Our Future came about to feed hungry kids. And then it is only cascaded from there. We have a new fraud in Minnesota worth hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars that seems to come out every week. So as people recognize in Minnesota that we're very generous, people take advantage when they move in. That's the whole point. Everybody who is moving into our state en masse are moving because they see an opportunity in Minnesota.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the political makeup as it relates to the geography of Minnesota? So in my mind, and you might categorize it differently, but you have, the metro area, and then you have rural Minnesota, and then you have the Iron Range.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's another part of the state that you would bifurcate aside from that, but can you kind of explain the motivations of each section there?
So like many states, Minnesota had this heritage of, we call the Democrats of Minnesota, they call themselves the Democrat Farmer Labor Party, DFL. So when they're on the ballot, it's not Democrat Republican, it's Democrat Farmer Labor Party, which had to do with party consolidation at some point in Minnesota's history.
Yep.
But that had defined Minnesota and the geographical makeup in Minnesota and the politics that came from that for a very long time. So to kind of give you a sense of it, the Twin Cities metro area, like many states, is become almost reliably blue. And that was not always the case. You used to have your suburban Republican makeup, and Minneapolis, St. Paul, those places have been DFL for a long time, even though there was Democrat turned Republican. Now, Norm Coleman was probably the last conservative mayor of St. Paul. But you had the Twin Cities metro area, which was probably purple, but the suburbs were red because you still had this kind of Mitt Romney-esque Republican, high net worth individuals. They still cared about taxes back then more than they cared about hating Trump. And
the people who vote for Eric Paulson.
Eric Paulson would be he'd be a great example of like somebody who maybe like kind of fit that mold.
Yeah.
So then you had blue parts of the state, be it the Iron Range, farmers in western and southern Minnesota. You had pockets of blue throughout the state. And like many states, that's kind of flipped on its head in the last 2 years. The Iron Range, which is kind of like union iron workers, iron mining is a big industry up there. And that used to be kind of your union blue dog Democrat district area, even up to 3-4 years ago. Same with, my current district, which is about 45-50 minutes north of the Twin Cities. That was more of like a blue collar union environment up until about 2006. And now you look at Minnesota, and there is one mole in Minnesota of blue, right? And the rest of it is red. And the reason you still don't have results like you do in Pennsylvania, right, is because Pennsylvania has different regional pockets that still have enough conservative votes to override whatever Pittsburgh is doing or whatever Philadelphia is doing. In Minnesota, we don't have those same population centers outside of the Twin Cities metro. So as the metro goes, so goes most of the state on a statewide basis. And I think a pretty good comparison to Minnesota is like Oregon. I actually think we're maybe a little bit more conservative naturally there. But Minnesota is also kind of a miracle, right? Because even though we're a blue state and we haven't voted for a Republican president since Richard Nixon, you still have chambers that flip all the time. You still have kind of regional success. In 2022, we almost had a Republican attorney general because our current attorney general is Keith Ellison, for those who don't know that name. But there's a number of things to be encouraged about, but we're small ball, I think, when it comes to like national money, national attention, that kind of thing.
Well, I think part of that, too, is, and I don't necessarily want to get you into trouble here, but the Republican apparatus in Minnesota has not been great.
Yeah. A disaster.
Between, the disorganization of the state party, which I used to work for and was fired from, which you will remember very well. But also, candidates who are, very, I guess, mealy-mouthed is the best way to put it. Like they're not fully with the president, his agenda, and so on. Like, can you talk more about why the infrastructure is so bad?
Yeah, it's just been a compiling series of bad decisions and bad leadership over the course of 25, 30 years, right? And I think Tim Pawlenty was our last Republican governor, and during his second term, I think really did prioritize trying to run for president again. And in so doing, a lot of kind of basic infrastructure, which good state parties have, was left to the wayside back then and has continued to be left by the wayside just because of series after series of just not super great leadership. So we don't have the infrastructure in place to do things like the ballot harvesting stuff that you saw maybe in like a state like Pennsylvania. When I was a Republican National Committee man, I got to see other really competent state parties, and we're just not close to that. And because we don't have like a national eye on us, right? A lot of these state parties get reinvigorated. The infrastructure gets reinvigorated by national money. But Minnesota has been this great mirage for a number of candidates, whether you're running for governor. Donald Trump, I think after 2016, made it his mission to try to win Minnesota again. I think that was actually personally a thing that he wanted to do.
He tweeted about it a lot. Yeah.
I'll just tell you real quick. In 2016, Donald Trump did like a flyby rally in Bloomington, where our airport is. And you would not believe it was at that moment back in 2016 when you and I were working together where it was like, whoa, he might do this, because there's a main freeway right by that airport hangar that he spoke at. And you saw people basically parking their cars on the side of the freeway like this is some Beatles concert or something like that, just figuring out any old place to put your car to go see Donald Trump in Minnesota. So there is this kind of great debate happening now in our state where do you embrace the president's agenda? Is that a winning message in Minnesota? And then you have another faction that is basically like, we need to return to old school 2008 style Republican politics because we've lost so many people in that that suburban core, which determines our elections.
Yeah, because that's what gets people to line up their cars on the highway is politics from 20 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think John McCain had people lining up for a rally at the airport in Minnesota.
No, I think that's right. Well, one of the things I think that people who haven't been to Minnesota before, see or hear about the most is that Minneapolis has turned into, what do they call it? Little Mogadishu.
Sure. Yeah.
It has become, I believe it is the highest population of Somalis outside of Somalia in the entire world is in the state of Minnesota. Why is that?
Well, it goes back to what I said before, where when we talk about the benefits that our state has, the generosity that we have NGOs and nonprofits who facilitate a lot of that immigration stuff to come to Minnesota. And it was interesting. We just had a mayoral election 2 weeks ago in Minnesota between Jacob Frey and Omar Fateh. That was getting the same publicity, or near the publicity, that the New York City mayor's race was getting. And what's been uncovered since that mayoral election, and you see people...
Frey won.
Frey won. Yeah. It was close, but Frey won. And what's actually been uncovered by Democrats, as I follow them on X, and you see the discourse between them, Jacob Frey actually leaned into a tribal war that was happening among, a Somali population in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And what was fascinating is you're sitting here going, what does that mean? Well, apparently there are different factions that we have now adopted in Minnesota that Jacob Frey leaned into, whatever divide there is. I don't know the specific economic or cultural or where you came from. If you're from Mogadishu and you're from Somaliland, I don't know the technicalities of it. But apparently Jacob Frey went full race realism, if you will, by leaning into some kind of tribal conflict and got a contingent of the Somali population that way.
Yeah.
Because Omar Fateh wasn't the right Somali.
He picked the Hutus over the Tutsi or whatever.
Whatever it is. I don't know. But it's not me saying it. It's Democrat activists saying it in Minnesota that, Jacob Frey leaned into the worst of us by going back to some historical warring faction to win his election.
It's just so goofy. Well, I've seen these clips of him too speaking Somali.
Yeah, speaking Somali, but then he'll speak Somali at one rally, and then he'll get in booty shorts and go down to the gay pride parade right after that. It is this coalition of dysfunction that runs that city, and it was on display for the world to see in 2020 when that city burned to the ground, and you saw mass incompetence between the mayor, especially our governor, not calling the National Guard out on time. You had mainstream news. You had Care 11, which is our NBC affiliate in Minnesota, go on air and be like, where are any of our leaders right now?
Yeah.
And it's just this repeated cycle of failed leadership.
Yeah. I am going to get to the George Floyd stuff, but for people who haven't been to Minnesota before, I want to talk about what this experience is actually like, having so many refugees from a foreign country in your state. I find it hard to explain to people, who have been in DC for a number of years. No. You go to any Target or Starbucks or whatever, and literally everybody that works there is in a hijab. Can you talk more about when you go to the cities? I know it's not like this where you live necessarily, but when you go to these cities, what is it like actually on the ground?
It's really interesting. I was in New York City last week, right? It was right after the election happened, and I'll get to the actual how immigration has impacted our state, broadly speaking. But at first, I wanted to just talk about how Minneapolis is, for all intents and purposes, like a destroyed city, right? I went to New York City last week, is the point that I was getting to. And obviously there's a population difference, right? So I'm going to give your biggest Jacob Frey defenders that. But there was such life in that city despite its problems, because I think they take public safety seriously, because I think they take actually creating a vibrant culture there seriously. And in Minneapolis, you will go to downtown Minneapolis and it will look like a ghost town when it should be rush hour traffic. And that's because Minnesota had draconian COVID policies back then, and everyone is work from home, and everyone has been work from home for the last 5 years. In fact, you have government employees who say that it's basically torture for them to come back into the office now. And because of that, it's a ghost town. So high crime impacts that, but then just also bad government does too. So getting to refugee resettlement and immigration and kind of what that looks like. The great promise of, and I promise of America is that we're a melting pot, right? Come here from all over the place and integrate into our Western worldview. And you will have success because we've had success with all sorts of immigrants for the last 300 years, 250 years. But when we talk about kind of this new type of immigrant, and this is not all of them, I am very close with lots of Somali, Hmong activists who are Republican. But what ends up happening is there is not this idea of a melting pot. There's a cloistering. There is a certain tribalism that has happened in Minnesota, as I referenced before in the mayoral election. And so when you have people here who stay in their group, who basically operate as almost like self-governing societies, that has had an impact on our state. And I won't say that all fraud have been perpetrated by Somalis. There's been plenty of cases where the fraudsters look like me or you. But because Minnesota, like I said before, constantly boasts about how generous our welfare programs are, that attracts a certain type of mindset. And over and over again, you're catering to a group that is that wants to stay to themselves. And that's probably the best way I can say it. The reason that it's changed a lot is because you have a group that mainly stays to itself.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that's particularly crazy to me, and it was interesting to see this borne out in, I saw some statistic recently that something like, I want to say it was like 50% of Somali men in particular are unemployed. And that's the thing that's interesting. Like, again, when you go to Target or you go to Starbucks, it's almost always the women that are out working. And it's like almost none of the, I used to live in an apartment complex, and it was like the men just lounging around at the pool all day while the women were working. It was very bizarre.
Yeah, I don't know how to explain it more than it's policies which encourage refugee resettlement. It's policies which encourage people to come from other states and other countries to specifically Minnesota. In some cases to take advantage in a legitimate way of the welfare system, and in some ways to take advantage in a dishonorable or an unlawful way. And we see the repercussions of that, not only like the cultural impact, but again, the economic impact of, we had an $18 billion surplus and took it to a $6 billion deficit. And meanwhile, our U.S. attorney basically said it's at least $2.5 billion worth of fraud. And unfortunately, you look around at what these fraud cases are, and a lot of it is food programs that are administered to the Somali community. It's autism centers, which are, again, catered to the Somali community. And it's an unfortunate circumstance that we find ourselves in. I would really draw the distinction. It's not blaming a group of people, but it is blaming what we're enabling.
It's blaming the system that we built.
That's right.
That does this.
That's right.
Yeah. One other interesting thing about sort of the infrastructure in Minnesota that I've noticed perhaps even more since moving away is that almost all the institutional capital in Minnesota is left-wing and catered to left-wing ends. Like almost all of the richest people in Minnesota donate to the left. I mean, the Polads, who are horrible owners of a sad baseball team.
Minnesota's biggest Kamala Harris donors.
Yeah.
And they have totally trashed the Minnesota Twins as a baseball team.
Exactly.
Horrible.
So
tragedy.
Can you and there are a lot of like huge companies, like 3M is a great example that are headquartered in Minnesota. And I don't know about who owns 3M or whatever, so don't take this as an attack on their CEO. But can you talk more about like sort of how the institutional wealth is arrayed to benefit the DFL in Minnesota?
Yeah. There is a huge infrastructure that the DFL has built in Minnesota. And if you want to take what I believe to be a realist view of the fraud that's happening in Minnesota. The fraud is committed, money is dispersed, we don't know where the money goes, but there is a circular thing that happens in Minnesota where, lo and behold, most of the politicians that benefit from fraudsters donating to their campaigns, all of them are DFL politicians. Republicans are not benefiting from this windfall of fraud through fraud is committed. Somebody makes a donation. We find out that the person who made the donation was one of the fraudsters, so on and so forth. So that's a big chunk of what we need to realize, and what your audience needs to hear about in Minnesota is this fraud is actually a circular grift that gets paid back to the DFL party. Beyond that, legitimate institutions, if you want to call it that.
In quotation marks.
We have a very powerful union system, a very powerful public union system in Minnesota, which is uniformly voting and donating to the DFL. We have mainstream media, specifically our largest paper in Minnesota, which is an incredibly biased paper. Obviously, there's academia and then the business community as well. Most states are known for having your token billionaire or two who's reliable for Republicans every election cycle. We do not have that in Minnesota. To your point earlier, most of the wealth, if you go back to 2022, I ran the governor's campaign on the Republican side in 2022, and you see the average donation of Scott Jensen, who is the Republican candidate. We raised about $6.5 million, which I believe was the most that a Republican had ever raised statewide. Scott's donors were $50 here, $30 here. And then you're getting just trounced by Tim Walz, and you look down the list, and it's max out donation, max out donation, max out donation. And when I say max out donations, because obviously we have a limit for candidates in Minnesota, but those same people then are also cutting checks to a number of left-wing 501c4 groups in Minnesota. The biggest one being something called Alliance for a Better Minnesota. And they are...
I forgot about these people.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about them in probably 10 years, man.
One thing I just want to say, though, is the DFL are competent operators. They are deadly serious about their politics. I tend to think it's because politics is their religion.
Yeah.
But they're competent operators who also are well-funded. But Alliance for a Better Minnesota is run by Alita Messenger, who is a Rockefeller, who is Mark Dayton, our former governor, his ex-wife runs that group. And beyond the party, beyond the Democrat Party in Minnesota, which gets a ton of money, beyond the unions, which get a ton of money, beyond the fraud that's happening is kickbacks to the Democrat Party potentially. You also have this attack wing organization where this one woman and a series of donors, if they needed to turn on a faucet of $10, $12 million overnight, if they felt a real threat, they are able to mobilize and do it just like that.
Yeah.
And they do stuff like the ballot harvesting. They do stuff like, obviously, media campaigns, mainly attack ads. And even when you run a well-funded campaign from Minnesota standards, you're drowned in that operation. I tend to think, Nick, that Minnesota is more red than we give it credit for. But because of these series of things, including the infrastructure, including people's ability to actually get out and vote in an off year, that we're just drowned in the process. Yeah. Republicans are just drowned in the process.
Yeah. I'm going to do some of our greatest hits here. Should we do some Ken Martin bashing?
Ken Martin.
Let's just do it.
Hey, listen, in Minnesota, Ken Martin, and it might just be because Minnesota's an easy job.
Yeah.
Right? If you're a Democrat, you think Tina Smith is a super talented politician. You think Tim Walz is a super talented politician. It might just be an easy job.
Yeah.
When Ken Martin was here as the Democrat chair in Minnesota, it appeared like he was running a military operation. It was that good sometimes. Oh, yeah. But again, like Tim Walz, you see him on the national stage. It seems like someone's calling for his head every day.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So Ken Martin, now head of the DNC, for people who haven't been paying attention.
He's the Minnesota party chair.
He used to be head of the Minnesota DFL. What are some of the craziest things from his career in Minnesota over the last 10 years?
He won a lot in Minnesota. He didn't have a whole lot of like personal controversy. I had heard that one of his kids was MAGA, which was interesting.
Based.
So maybe you can have him on the show.
Yeah.
But the new guy, his name is Richard Karlbaum or something like that. Former Tim Walz staffer.
Okay.
We went from Ken Martin, who kind of ran this, at least perception-wise, a pretty competent operation, to this Richard Karlbaum. Is like, what he's known for right now is like, he'll tweet drunk at 1 a.m. Like there'll be these long string of angry tweets at Republican candidates. So
has he done that? Have you gotten the honor yet?
Not yet. I'm sure it's coming. Maybe this
will get it.
Maybe this podcast will do it. No, but Minnesota, our political exports when it comes to national politics, it's like we're an embarrassment over and over and over again. Tim Walz, Amy Klobuchar ran for president, ran one of the most pathetic campaigns that I can remember seeing. Our sound bites, right? Ilhan Omar has some ridiculous soundbite. Tina Smith has some ridiculous soundbite. Amy Klobuchar, it's like an embarrassment. And I think it's because when you're a Democrat politician in Minnesota, you get to just ride the machine. You are not challenged. You are not, the greases are, the skids are greased for you in Minnesota. One really interesting example, again, when I ran the campaign in 2022 on the Republican side for governor, we had done all this Oppo research on the Chinese connections that Tim Walz had, on his stolen valor stuff.
Yeah,
this is huge. This idea that this is all brand new. I got a lot of texts. It was like, why didn't you guys ever talk about this in Minnesota? We did. There was no new opposition research. It's just that our media infrastructure in Minnesota was in the bag for Tim Walz. The example that I wanted to give you was we did a press conference in 2022 about the stolen valor issue. And we brought out other veterans and we did the whole kick and caboodle about how Tim Walz lied about his rank and lied about weapons of war, lied about all this stuff. Star Tribune ran a headline after that press conference that said, Scott Jensen and Matt Burke, governor, lieutenant governor, comma, two men who never served, comma, criticized Tim Walz's military record. And from there, the story was buried.
Wow.
So when he got to the vice presidential level, I just want to reiterate, there was no new Oppo research.
Yeah.
It was all on a plate. And I kind of feel bad for Kamala Harris because she's probably sitting here going, I got this squeaky clean guy. Like he's got nothing in his past. It just so happens that he has a ton. It's just not been covered.
Yeah. You know, one of the interesting comments I get from conservatives when they look at the state of the conservative movement in Minnesota, aside from their sadness at how bad it all is there's one shining star, which is Alpha News.
Yes. Everybody
is really into Alpha News. I actually really enjoyed the podcast that Tucker Carlson did with Liz Collins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, because this was starting
when we were running.
Yeah. Yep. When you and I
think
were
they just celebrated their 10 years of existing like a week ago.
Yeah. So what is Alpha News? How did that all come about? And what are some of the things that they've uncovered in the last couple of years?
So Alpha News, and it's run by Liz Collin, who many of you may have heard of. Maybe you haven't. I would Google her if you haven't. Alpha News is an independent media outlet that has been bubbling up in Minnesota, and it's gained a lot of traction over the past, call it 5 years. And I think it's because Minnesotans, like I said before, our traditional media in Minnesota, a lot of people think media is in the bag for Democrats. And that might be true. It is true elsewhere. In Minnesota, it's nakedly true.
Yeah.
Right? So people are being fed garbage from their traditional media outlets. Well, on comes this mainly online publication called Alpha News. And I think a number of different people fund it. I think it was associated with something called the Freedom Club in Minnesota for a long time and has become totally independent. So real coverage of the George Floyd riots, real coverage of the actual fraud that's taken place. They have broken story after story. I mean, there are stories about how, I think they just did a recent story about how a teacher locally in Minnesota, it was taking AI images of his students and ended up getting charged for it. But when it comes to the actual perpetrators of the fraud, when it comes to the actual crime statistics in Minnesota, Liz Collin and Alpha News have been the only real source for people to get alternative information. And Minnesota's a target-rich environment. We have a lot going on. And every time you see kind of a national story that puts egg on the Democrat face, nationally, it probably came from Liz Collin and Alpha and the team at Alpha News there. So I'm immensely, if I have any nugget of hope for politics in Minnesota, it's that organization actually getting the truth out. They also did the documentary, I don't want to screw the name up, but The Fall of Minneapolis, where they actually produced a really well done documentary about every failure along the way that happened in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and I think that is a great segue to one of the biggest tragedies over the last couple of years in Minnesota, which was the destruction and hollowing out of Minneapolis, starting with the George Floyd riots, which I think I was here in DC for the George Floyd riots here.
Mm-hmm.
They did not hold a candle to the damage that I saw when I came to Minneapolis after. Can you give the sort of trajectory as to what happened in those riots in the Twin Cities?
Before I dive into that, one other thing that I just wanted to make note of Alpha News that might be of interest to the audience is that Alpha News is the only one who is covering what's kind of happening to the police officers that were prosecuted during the George Floyd
And I'm going to come back to that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So good on them. The riots, totally, it's just the culmination of how incompetent our government has been for a long time. We finally had the powder keg blow up after George Floyd died in Minneapolis. And I'm going to repeat, I know it's probably common knowledge at this point, but it was very apparent that something was going to happen. A riot was going to happen. Between Tim Walz and Jacob Frey, Tim Walz, I remember the night that it happened where the city went up in flames. Tim Walz was blaming everybody but himself. And at the same time saying the buck stops with me. He was blaming Jacob Frey. This was where the famous quote came out about, what am I going to do? Call out the National Guard? Those are just a bunch of fry cooks, 19-year-old fry cooks. It's like, this dude has no sense for what his job is in a time of crisis. And he not only blamed Jacob Frey, he blamed other people on the ground level. It was ultimately his call to get the National Guard out. But even during the fog of misinformation that was happening throughout that time, Tim Walz was blaming white supremacists for the riot. He was blaming the Mexican drug cartels for the riot. He was just grabbing onto anyone he could to say, these are all people from out of state. It's not our own people. There was this famous story about Umbrella Man.
Yeah.
If you remember this, Umbrella Man, it was one guy who set like one fire and he had a mask on, like was holding an umbrella and knocking out windows with an umbrella. Well, the narrative got spun, or he spun it in his own mind, and other Democrat activists in Minneapolis spun it in their own mind that the guy who caused all the riots was the white guy.
Yeah. Was
Umbrella Man.
Yep.
What more can you say beyond, like, this guy had a job to do. He didn't call the National Guard for, it was almost 72 hours as the city burned. We lost a precinct. We lost a police precinct to arson during these riots. And between Jacob Frey and Tim Walz, that police force in that building were running out of there as the police station was going up in flames because they were told to. They were told to stand down and let it burn. And so since then, the fallout since then is we have had a massive drop in our police force in Minneapolis. We are not even close. I don't even think we're half staffed in Minneapolis to like the numbers they say they need. I believe we're half or close to half of that. And there's been a series of people who've gotten out of the profession completely, because of mental health disability. They just can't handle the job as it is. And with that, you have seen a great hollowing out of Minneapolis. When I was in college, there was a place called Uptown, and it was the hopping place.
Yep.
Nightclubs, restaurants, it's where you want it to be. If you go to Uptown now, at best, it's unoccupied. At worst, it's an open air drug market. And you have neighborhood after neighborhood, downtown after downtown within the confines of Minneapolis that everything's gone, dude. There is no activity. There's no growth. There's no hope. Great. You elected Jacob Fry, the guy who's managed this failure for the last 10 or so years. All I can say is it's a lifeless city now. And we have not recovered from it. We did not recover from the COVID lockdowns either. So the combination of those two things, you've had plenty of downtowns, plenty of cities across the country who have recovered and are thriving again. Minneapolis, it doesn't look like it's going to thrive forevermore. This might, in real time, this might very well be the next Detroit that we're looking at.
Well, so that was actually going to be my next point. Was people always like to talk about how bad Detroit is. I went to Detroit this summer.
Mm-hmm.
It was way nicer than post George Floyd and post COVID Minneapolis.
Yes.
That is how bad the situation is.
It's truly, truly sad. And beyond that too, it's like Tim Walz and Democrats in Minnesota, they like to hang their hat on, we're a very generous state. We're giving kids free meals in schools now. But the other thing that Minnesota, at least with all of its lumps you could take, was that our education system used to be really good in Minnesota, right? You had suburban schools and public schools that Minnesota for a long time. There's that classic Time Magazine article, The Good Life in Minnesota, which talked a lot about how great our public school education is. If you trust ACT scores and you trust test scores right now, and part of this does have to do with, again, we're bringing in people who are non-producers or who are not interested in family or raising their children, and we're exporting people who are producers. Like that is just straight line economics, right? But when you look at the data on our test scores, we're doing worse than Mississippi, Alabama. We're falling behind in those categories too. So it's a combination of like broken education system that we're doubling down on and the immigration thing that we talked about before too.
Yeah. I want to draw attention to what happened to the police officers who were involved in George Floyd's arrest. I don't think anybody should be forgetting about Derek Chauvin in particular, who has been sentenced to be in prison for a very long time. And the other officers involved, one of whom was released,
last week?
Yeah, last week. I think this was also a dangerous thing, during the Biden era, where a lot of people forgot about the January 6th protesters, and we left a lot of those people to rot. So what is happening? What did happen and what is happening now with those police officers who were in prison?
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't know unless we had Alpha News and Liz Collin, who has been following up on that story. My understanding, and I know the attorney now for Derek Chauvin, my understanding is they're just exploring all options. It's a really precarious situation because Derek Chauvin, because of the civil rights conviction that he had, is in federal prison right now. And I think we found out last year that he had gotten stabbed in federal prison. So the man's life is under threat in federal prison. But people were saying Trump is going to pardon him. Trump is going to pardon him. Well, a pardon takes care of the federal charges. That's my understanding. I don't think Derek Chauvin would want to be in a state prison. I don't think you would want to come back to Minnesota and be in a prison in Minnesota. And I've talked to people who know the situation better than I do and pretty much agree with that, because if you're getting shanked in federal prison, well, come back to the state where, you were convicted originally. And I think they're exploring every option that they can legally, but we wouldn't know. We wouldn't even know about the stabbing. We wouldn't know about all sorts of things had it not been for Liz Collin, who is married to Bob Kroll.
I was going to bring up Bob Kroll,
who is the head of the Minnesota Peace and Police Officers Association, which is kind of the police union across the state of Minnesota. And so I think between the two of them, there's an acute interest in how our law enforcement is treated in Minnesota, because they've been treated very, very poorly. And that spurred on making sure that we still have eyes on Derek Chauvin, that, you know, that one day we're not going to just find out that, he did die in prison because he got shanked. But there's a really competent lawyer working on his case. I don't know what's going to come of it. Yeah. I would just not recommend. I can't, like, I wouldn't recommend the pardon, you know, because it's like, if that takes care of your federal case and they ship you back to Minnesota, you're done. Do
you know how long his state sentence is?
The federal sentence is 25 years or something like that. And I think the state sentence is right around there too.
Man.
And the rest of these police officers, when you watch that original video, who had little to nothing to do with it, Tao, I believe is his name, that just got released from.
He got hit with 5 years or
5
something
years,
like that?
5 years for standing there.
Yeah.
And I think most police officers, if you talk to them, boots on the ground cops in Minneapolis, look at that and they're like, who in this state has our back? Who will actually defend us if something like that were to happen again? Because it's knives out for these people. I mean, most at Minneapolis City Council, they were at defund the police rallies back in 2020. Half of them probably still believe it. People I serve with on the House who try to like project themselves now as moderate because they're in a swing district. A lot of them were at these defund the police rallies in Minneapolis too. So I think these cops, the reason that we're not able to fully staff Minneapolis and the reason that we have a shortage, which will continue to exasperate the problem, is because they look around and they're like, who's got our back?
Yeah.
And I think it makes a good case for when Trump talks about, you know, sending in the National Guard. I think that's reasonable for Minneapolis. I think that it might help revive some of the areas that are now either open air drug markets or just riddled with crime.
Yeah. It seems like the times in Minnesota and the politics are very dire. And back when I worked in the Minnesota State Legislature for the Republican Conference, another job I got fired from, which you will also remember.
Are you noticing a trend here?
Yeah, I know.
You can't get fired from this one if you own it.
Yeah,
so.
That's exactly right. But they, by and large, the members were, frankly, boomers who were not suited for the times. Mm-hmm. They did not know the political times we were going through and how bad things were going to get.
Yeah.
I have not admittedly kept up with the state legislature since then. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about the state of, the Republicans that serve in the House and the Senate now? What their worldview is, what the factions are, and so on, and whether or not they take these challenges seriously?
So part of that is still there, no doubt about it. But then within my caucus, within the Republican House side of which is what I am most intimately familiar with because I'm involved in it, you've had, I think, about half our caucus get elected at this point in the last 2 to 4 years. And with that has come kind of a new, fresh perspective, new blood. I think people who know what time it is for the most part. And there's always a little bit of tension between kind of that old guard thinking and that Minnesota, America First type legislator. And it goes back to what we said earlier in the podcast, where that really is the conundrum for Republicans' direction in Minnesota, because you still have an old guard who wants to, again, go back to 2008, 2012 politics, because they see that as the key to unlocking statewide victory in Minnesota. And then you have another faction who says, actually, Trump came the closest here. We need to double down and embrace his populist policies. Classic example is next year, we're going to have a United States Senate election. Tina Smith has retired. She's had some health issues or what have you. That race is pretty sleepy right now. But you see that old guard that I talked about before, you'll get a kick out of this, is they are trying to do a draft Tim Pawlenty campaign to run for U.S. Senate again.
So bad.
So Tim Pawlenty was a 2-term governor in Minnesota and ran for president, really moderated his stances, tried to run for governor again in 2018, got beat by an upstart candidate named Jeff Johnson. Well, I shouldn't say upstart, more of a grassroots candidate named Jeff Johnson, got beat real bad in that primary. And because no one is leading a new way in Minnesota, you still have those people who have that old school thinking who say, hey, if we just get Tim Pawlenty back, that's our that's our key. It's almost like there's not original thinking in this state in a lot of ways, but there is this dynamic of like generally younger, fresher perspective, new ideas, hard chargers, and the friction it causes between the people who still kind of maintain control.
Yeah. Is Joe McDonald still there?
Joe McDonald is still there.
Dude.
Representative Joe McDonald. He is one of my colleagues.
I freaking love Joe
Great
McDonald.
guy.
I haven't talked to him in years, but one of the most
great guy,
wonderful people.
Photographer, Irish guy. He'll let you know. He'll let you know how Irish
guy
he is.
I have ever met in my life.
So shout out Joe McDonald if you're watching this.
Shout out Joe McDonald. Literally one of the best bosses I've ever had.
Yeah,
he was great.
Cool
he was
dude.
not the one that fired me. So
well, that's good.
He was an amazing guy. Well, Max, where can people keep up with the important work that you're doing in Minnesota and keep up with all the exciting things to come?
Yeah, well, 2 things. I would say I'm on X. Sometimes I go through streaks where I tweet a lot. You know, sometimes business takes over my life, but I'm Max R. Rymer on X. And like I said, beyond that, to just kind of get a pulse of what's really happening in Minnesota, go look up Alpha News. Go look up them on X, follow them. You're going to get it straight from the horse's mouth from that organization. It's the only thing probably worth following from a Minnesota perspective.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on Moment of Truth.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Moment of Truth. And thank you to Max for coming on. He flew all the way from the great state of Minnesota just to come and do that. This has been an episode I've been wanting to do for a long time, and it's always great to see an old friend and mentor. So this episode was particularly fun for me to do. I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. Thank you again for tuning in to Moment of Truth, and we will see you again next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.